What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another logical, plausible, probable stream. We've actually got a special event here tonight because unlike some of the more fiery open discussions that are known to unfurl on this channel, especially into the evening, tonight we actually have the privilege of being joined by philosopher and theologian Kenneth Samples, a man who has a great passion to help people understand the reasonableness and the relevance of Christianity's truth claims. And he's written quite a few different books, and is several of which I found very interesting. One's The Classical Christian Thinkers, 7 Truths That Changed the World, and God Among Sages. And he's actually the second member of the Reasons to Believe organization I've had the pleasure of interviewing. And in fact, I was telling him before we went live that the very first author I had the privilege of interviewing on this channel was PhD biochemist Dr. Fuzz Rana. He took a chance on my channel in the very, very early days. So it was awesome when the team over at Reasons to Believe reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to have Kenneth on talk about his new book, which I want to tell everybody about. And today we're going to be discussing his most recent amazing piece, in my opinion. It's called Christianity Cross-Examined. Is it rational, relevant, and good? And I can tell you it is well worth the time to check out and read and really dive into some of the great counter, shall we say, to a lot of those talking points that we hear ad nauseum. It's available over on Amazon if you want the Kindle version, and if you want get a hard copy, go over to reasons.org. Got the links in the description. Make sure you go and check that out. And it's real worth your time. We want to be able to have the time to scratch the surface of all things that are covered in this awesome piece of literature. Kenneth, thanks so much for taking the time to come on. And how are you doing? What's going on in the world of Reasons to Believe? And thank you so much for spending the time with us tonight.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. I really appreciate your invitation, and things are going well at Reasons to Believe. We're certainly excited that we're having more opportunity to get out and do apologetic events. And so I think everything is going well, and my new book has recently come out, and that's always kind of a special time. You put a lot of work into the book, and to actually see it and hold on to it and give it to some of your family and friends is a nice feeling.
Oh, I can imagine. I've been working on a book myself and have not completed it. I mean, you've written multiple, so I know you have the feeling much better than I do. But I understand what you're saying in terms of the work, the effort, the focus, and the trying to make. If you're anything like me, I assume you probably had the kind of an end thought of what your objective was for it, and taking the time to put it all together can be a strenuous but rewarding task.
No doubt about it. There's an old saying that I don't like writing, but I like having written. I think that's the real thing. But whenever I've gone to a bookstore or into a library, I wonder sometimes, do people who come and look at the books know what kind of investment it takes to write a good quality book? Now, I'm not saying all of them are good quality books, but I know to put out a book that really is something meaningful to your readers, boy, it takes everything I've got to do that.
Now, it's interesting you say that the lack of appreciation. I was thinking about this just in context of, the knowledge that we have available to us now. The other day I was in downtown Nashville, and I went to the main library in Nashville. It's this beautiful old building, and I was walking through, and I was kind of contemplating the sheer volume of knowledge that was housed in all of these tomes that I was walking through. Yeah. And how just the average modern human takes for granted the access to information that we have, whether it be for free, in many cases just by going online or watching a video on YouTube or going to a library and checking things out. And yet so few of us are there's actually a decline in the percentages of people who are taking the time to go and gain knowledge. Before we get into more, things about your book, what are your thoughts about that? It's kind of off the cuff question, but what do you think about that as a scholar yourself? Does that strike you as a disturbing problem that we face?
Yeah, 2 things. One, when I was a young person, my challenge was getting access to information, going to libraries. In our home, I mean, we had an encyclopedia set, an almanac, and things like that. Today, my son, for example, I mean, he can go online and he has no problem with access, but his problem now is different than mine. What can I trust? How can I discern through it? I also wrote a blog article this week about a study that was done 10 years ago. This was a huge study over 20 years, and the conclusion was families that have a library of 500 books, the children level of education moves up 3 years. So having 500 books in your library is like having graduate level trained parents. And I thought, wow, what if everybody in America had access to a really fine library? What would that do to our nation? What would that do to the state of, using your mind?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I think one of the key points I took away from what you just said was the equivalent of having that higher level of education.
Yeah.
And one of the things I find very fascinating is these ongoing arguments that somehow the only way to have knowledge is if you have the piece of paper,
right,
that says you have the knowledge, versus do you have the intellectual capacity, the ambition, and the drive and the motivation to go and take advantage of this information that we're talking about and go and expand your own level of knowledge, whether you might not be necessarily the equivalent of the scholar such as yourself who spent who knows how many years professionally focused on these things, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't be able to carry on a high level conversation at a minimum, right? And understand the concepts and be able to reach your own conclusions and analyze the evidence and the pieces of information that are put forward to you to reach your conclusions, rather than just relying on being told what you should think. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I was talking to my wife the other day, what would I advise to young minds today? I'd be very tempted to say, go over and get Mortimer Adler's Great Books of the Western World and just read through it. I think you've made a very powerful point, and that is we have lots of people who get educations, but does that really equate to thinking carefully, critically, working through claims? And I think that reading classical books can give you an education you may never get at any particular university.
No, it's a very good point. I find it very interesting, actually, and we'll circle back around and get back focused on the actual topic at hand, because I could talk to you about this all night. I do find it very interesting how many of those works that you're referring to are almost being ostracized now, and people are saying, "Don't read those great works." And to me, I find that very disturbing, and I question those who make those arguments. Number one, I'm like, have you read it? Have you actually read it for yourself? Because some of those great classics that you're referring to, I mean, the critical thinking skills that are necessary to comprehend what is being said.
Yep.
And we're not even necessarily, I mean, just go back to, I wouldn't say these are like classic works necessarily, but like the Federalist Papers, just as an example. Like, if you don't have a high level of critical thinking skills, vocabulary, and information processing abilities and the patience to think and to analyze, you're not going to understand what's being argued, because they're arguing things from a psychological level or historic perspective, a civics, all the different civics angles, and really a understanding of human nature, which I think is extraordinarily profound about what was being argued in those works. I'm using them as a more recent example, I guess, and a relatively recent example. And now people don't even know what they say, have never even looked at them. And then we wonder why there's so much ease in terms of your point you're making about the concern for your son of, is what he's reading, can he trust it?
Yep.
And it's, well, if you don't have the underlying principles, knowledge of the underlying principles behind the arguments, then the ability to be swayed or convinced one way or the other, whether that's true or false, becomes an entirely different paradigm, in my opinion. And I think that kind of leads to, I'm guessing that kind of leads to where, what kind of inspired you to write this book. And as we mentioned earlier, like, I know you've written quite a few books, and I know most authors have either a moment of inspiration or were asked to write on a particular topic, or some kind of combination of the two. So what really led you to write this book, Christianity Cross-Examined?
Yeah, I think that most of the books that I've written, I've kind of carried around in my mind, in my head for a long time. 30 some years ago, I was working at the Christian Research Institute with Walter Martin, who was the original Bible Answer Man. And in those days, when I would go out to the academy, to the university to give talks, sometimes to faculty, often to the students, I would get truth questions. Does God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? What about Christianity in light of the other religions? However, moving forward, about 15 years ago, I noticed a change. Working at Reasons to Believe, I went to a major university in Missouri, and the questions almost completely changed from truth questions to questions about whether Christianity was good. Has Christianity been a good thing? What about slavery? What about women's rights? And I thought, wow, am I seeing kind of a transition? So I thought immediately, there aren't too many apologetic books that actually try to answer both questions. They look at the challenge to rationality. Is Christianity a rational faith? And then, is Christianity, has it been a good force for the world? And so some of these chapters I've been thinking about and had written articles about, but it was really kind of that sea change, I think. We might call it moving from a modernist perspective to a postmodern perspective.
Interesting. So in line with that, can you kind of relay to the audience, like, how did you divide this? What was I mean, you kind of structured it well, in my opinion. It's very well structured in the way you've got things kind of divided up. Can you kind of share with the potential readers and the listeners of like how you structured what you were just talking about?
Yeah, the first part of the book, I look at whether Christianity is rational. And so I look at questions about science, about logic, about history. The first question of the book is, hasn't science made God unnecessary? The second chapter also looks at science and raises the question, why do I need faith if I've got science? Third chapter looks at, isn't faith inconsistent with reason? And so I developed that first part looking very careful at the question about whether Christianity can stand when it comes to reason and rationality. The second part of the book then looks at whether Christianity has been a good force in the world. What about all the killing in the name of God? I mean, today we hear people constantly talking about the Inquisition, the Crusades, the Salem witch trials. I also look at the question of slavery, because a lot of people, when they read their English translation of the Old Testament, they see slave, they think, wow, the Bible has a slavery that is equivalent to the antebellum South. Then I look at whether God committed genocide when he chose to destroy the Canaanites using the people of Israel. And I look at other issues like the divisions in Christianity. And so I really do try to examine both of those questions seriously. And I try to quote Christianity's critics. I use their words. I try to present them in a context, because I really do believe in what I call the golden rule of apologetics, and that is I try to treat other people's ideas and beliefs the way I want mine treated. That doesn't mean I accept what other people say, but it does mean that I try to get their arguments right. I try to be fair-minded and respectful. And so I'm happy with, I think, the way the book came out. And if there is something distinct, and I'm kind of a classical thinker, I have great emphasis on people like St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, etc. I think if there is a unique feature of the book, it is kind of the way it's structured.
Well, it's interesting you're talking about the Thomas Aquinas and things, people like him, from the more classical perspective. One of the things I find very interesting in modern philosophy is there seems to be a tendency to try and like reinvent the wheel. Mm-hmm. And some of the, I'm not saying you can't customize or make slight modifications here and there to address new objections and things of that nature, but it almost seems like sometimes people try to overthink things rather than like, no, this is the foundation. And then this is a sidebar topic, but I think a large portion of that stems from this rapid acceleration in relation to subjectivity versus objectivity. And I know we hadn't really talked. I thought about this question until you started talking about it. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that any of what you're talking about kind of stems from that the retraction of objective and absolute truth from the philosophical conversation?
I do. I'm actually quite concerned. I used to think when it came to things like postmodernism, when it came to the fascination with identity politics, kind of looking at the world through race, gender, and class, I thought, well, those are just ideas that people at the university think about. Maybe most common folk, couldn't care less. I no longer view it that way. I now see that these ideas have permeated not only the university, but our culture. And I think that there is very much potentially a sea change. I mean, we may be living in a post-Christian society, maybe even a post-truth society. But what's interesting, of course, is when I go back and think about my reading of Plato's dialogues, and I think of Socrates and his battle with the sophists, they were raising those questions about, can you have objective truth? What about morality? Isn't it purely subjective? So in many ways, I think we are encountering in kind of a new age, but in many ways, it's kind of there's nothing new under the sun. It is kind of a repeat of these ideas. But personally, I take these ideas seriously because, ideas rule the world.
That's very true. One of the things that really, I'm sure that in the audience, people listening to you were outlining the chapters, they were probably thinking, wow, I've been listening to debates on YouTube about each one of these talking points. They're the top 10 kind of, lack of a better concept there. One of the things that I really liked that you addressed was the identification of the two major types of atheists in today's society. I would love, and I think the audience would love to hear your thoughts on this, because it's become a very hot topic, especially here in the YouTube world, where a lot of this is kind of in my opinion, is kind of the front lines.
Yeah, I think that there is two types of atheists that I have discovered that I think are very interesting, the way they kind of look at the world and the way they reason. One type of an atheist would say, look, I'm open to the idea that maybe there could be a God. If there was a God and I survived the death of my body, maybe be reunited with my loved ones, death would not be the final end of everything. I'm kind of open to that, but you know what? Belief in God and belief in these particular religions, especially Christianity, it's just not rational. Then you have kind of the flip side of atheists who say, no, there actually is some rationale to believing in God. But I don't want that God to exist. I don't want a God who's going to judge me, potentially torture me forever for the sins I've committed over 70 years of life. And if I were to put, I don't want to necessarily place an atheist in each of those camps, but Thomas Nagel has often said that he is a philosopher of mind, New York University, a friend of Alvin Plantinga, who may be the world's leading Christian philosopher. Nagel has said, I'm bothered that so many of the brightest people I know believe in God. And he has said categorically, I don't want that God to exist. Mm-hmm. Now, on the other side, I don't know if Graham Oppy would fit perfectly in that other category, but I've heard Dr. Oppy say, for example, that, there might be some positive things about believing in God, but it's impossible. It's impossible that God would believe. So I thought, wow, maybe I need to write a book that would do two things: try to show that Christianity is rational, but then maybe give some indication that it might be a good thing if you thought Christianity were true. So that's kind of the idea I develop a little bit in the introduction.
That's very good. And, one of kind of expanding on that, you address the quote unquote new atheists in your book. And, for anybody who's listening and watching this right now, you've seen my debates, and you know my opinion and my how I've addressed the new atheists versus the old atheists. Can you expand on that and kind of the explosion of and what that's turned into?
Yeah, when I studied philosophy, I had to read the old atheists, and I'll identify the old atheists, for example, as Bertrand Russell, brilliant man, brilliant mathematician, philosopher, debated Father Copleston in the 1940s on the BBC. Other leading old atheists, A.J. Ayer, one of the most brilliant analytic philosophers in England. Then I read many of the existential philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre, the leading French thinker. Others would be J.L. Mackie, for example. I found those atheists to be formidable. And what I think the difference is that unlike the new atheists, and I'll talk about them in a moment, I thought the old atheists were more formidable because they insisted on arguing, presenting arguments, but they also knew something about Christianity. Probably they had to study Christianity growing up in the world in which they did. And, reading Nietzsche knew Christianity. His father was a Lutheran minister, but Nietzsche also knew the potential vulnerabilities of Christianity. For example, Nietzsche would sometimes say, well, if you want me to believe in your Redeemer, why don't you act a little more redeemed? And it seemed to me that those atheists were willing to meet you on the rational ground, and they knew enough about Christianity to admit and say, you know what? You do have to take Augustine and Aquinas and various other thinkers in church history seriously because they're first rate. Now with the new atheists, I don't find them nearly as formidable, but I do find them to be very skilled at rhetoric. They're able to use sarcasm. They're able to use ridicule, satire. Sometimes they're quicker to the mark. I saw a debate with Christopher Hitchens and Alistair McGrath. McGrath has 3 PhDs from Oxford University. It's just a walking encyclopedia. But Hitchens was much more skilled at follow-up and using rhetoric. One of the reasons I think the new atheists, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Dan Dennett, but there are others, Peter Atkins at Oxford University, Jerry Coyne, there's a number of them. I think these new atheists have added to that the new list of skeptical people, the nones, the people who have no religious affiliation. But I don't find them to be as skilled because often they use satire and they don't know Christianity. They haven't studied it. They haven't even considered it worthy of their time. That's why they're not as good as some of the atheists of the past.
Well, I think an expansion on that point you just made there too stems from in the world of instant access that we currently live in. People think, oh, I read the bullet point that claims that XYZ argument is debunked. Therefore, I'm not even going to go and actually research whether or not it is invalidated. I'm just going to accept that it is on its face. Therefore, when somebody brings up that argument in a debate or a dialogue, I'm just going to act like that's a false promise, or my opponent is the ignorant one. And because I found it personally in a lot of my interactions, especially here on YouTube, the second you ask the follow-up question or that additional line of logic, magically you can see it. It's written all over their face of they have no idea what to do. And then it goes into one of those, they attempt one of those rhetoric tools you're talking about, dismissal, sarcasm, derision, so on and so forth, and try to end run or do a complete topic change and do a pivot away from it rather than actually defeat the secondary line of argument. Would you agree with that? Am I correct or incorrect? Am I making an assumption? What do you think about that concept?
No, I think you're being fair-minded there. I think it took me years to read the Summa Theologica by Aquinas. And the reason I discovered it took so long was, one, he's so brilliant, I had to follow step by step. But the other thing is that Aquinas considers almost every possible objection to his argument before he presents his argument. And, I think that our atheist friends are doing themselves a disservice if they don't recognize that people like Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, J.P. Moreland, there are numerous Christian thinkers that are careful. And I think the best thing we could do is, I would tell some of my atheist associates, you give me a book you want me to read, I'll give you a book I want you to read. Let's read them and let's work through them. And no, I think you're being fair. And that's not to say that there aren't some good atheists out there today, but they tend to be more careful, more reflective, and less given, again, I think, to a straw man, a misrepresentation of the position of the other individual.
No, that's very true. And obviously, I'm not trying to make the claim that people on our side of the equation aren't also sometimes fall into those same that same category. However, I think it's becoming very prevalent in the loudest of the new atheists, at least here online. And I think that kind of dovetails into one of the first things you address in the book, which is and I hear this on a very regular basis, especially from the new atheists, about the whole, scientific discovery has made God unnecessary. And I know you addressed this, but what are your thoughts on that? And have you noticed any specific talking points kind of in line with what we've just been discussing that are being used over and over and over again?
Yeah, I do. I think that there is a common sentiment that science is solidly in the secular perspective, that people who appeal to religion or people who have a theistic worldview, they're out of touch with kind of the best kind of science. One of the things I do in the very first chapter of the book is I say, this idea that science has made God unnecessary, not only does it ignore the fact that science was birthed one time in Western civilization, the middle of the 1600s in Europe, and the Christian worldview had a great influence on that. And historically, we see the founding fathers almost to a person were Christian or Jewish. But more than that, if you go back to the early part of the 20th century, there were a lot of skeptical philosophers, scientists, I should say, who thought we're going to discover a universe that's totally inhospitable to religion. But the reality is that's not the way things have developed. I mean, the origin of the universe, Big Bang cosmology that's been with us for more than 50 years. Now you can postulate and speculate about the many worlds hypothesis or the multiverse, but most scientists believe that Big Bang cosmology is essentially correct, that it implies a beginning, that matter, energy, space, and time had a singular beginning. Another element that atheist scientists thought they would discover is a universe that really is not designed, but fine-tuning has been a remarkable discovery. And again, it's not controversial today, the anthropic principle that life is possible because we live in a very fine-tuned universe. I look at our solar system, even planet Earth, consciousness, human exceptionalism. I think it's wrong to say that somehow science has made God unnecessary. I think the vistas that we have discovered in science and philosophy over the last century has made God even more important and has to be considered as a possible option to the rational individual.
No, I would completely agree with you. And I think something I find very, very fascinating myself is almost the willful ignorance of the points that you're talking about, and the blanket dismissal of, nobody actually thinks the fine tuning is real. And I'm like, No. The scientists agree that there's fine tuning. Now they argue over whether or not there's potential explanations for it external to an intelligent agent being necessary. But it doesn't mean that they don't agree that the improbabilities are so astronomical, they're incomprehensible.
Yep.
And that to me is very, I find it very, it's very bizarre in my opinion, and it kind of dovetails into something I'd love to ask you next, which is, and you address this in the book. So, for the audience, if you want to go and read about one of the things we hear ad nauseum here on YouTube is, the potential infinite regress, which kind of supposedly negates that need for the uncaused cause. Kind of, hey, let's debunk the Kalam and everything else, and it's become one of the new atheist favorites. So, if God created everything, then who created God? That the never-ending who designed the designer counter argument. Can you expand upon that and kind of give the audience a little bit of an insight into what you covered and how you dove into this in the book?
Yeah, what's interesting is this question of who made God. I mean, my children ask me that question. I've heard presidents of Atheist Society, Bertrand Russell asked that question, Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking. Atheists ask the question all the time. In fact, I discovered that in 2015, the most Googled question about God was who created God? If God created the world, who created God? And the way I think about it is this way. I suggest this, that if anything now exists, and I think most of us are pretty confident that something now does exist, that if anything now exists, then something must be eternal, or something that was not eternal emerged from nothing. And I then began to unpackage these ideas. What does it mean for something to possibly come from nothing? I mean, nothing. What is nothing? Kind of the Seinfeld question, right? What is nothing? Well, I would give you a definition of nothing: no matter, no energy, no space, no time, no actual, no potential, no ideas. I mean, the idea of something actually coming from nothing, I think, is logically impossible. And when Lawrence Krauss and others have talked about a universe that, or Stephen Hawking, a universe that comes into existence from nothing, really they're not talking about nothing. They're talking about the early elements of the universe. So if there is something that exists, then either something must be eternal or something non-eternal emerged from nothing. I think the idea that something comes from nothing is logically unacceptable. Therefore, we're left with something that's eternal, not a contingent, not something that is dependent, but something that is a non-contingent, a necessary reality. And then we have very few options. I mean, the atheist would like to propose that maybe the universe is it's just here. That's what Russell said to Copleston in 1948 on the BBC. It's just a brute reality. But of course, all of the science that we've had over the last century seems to indicate that the universe is not a brute reality. And even the multiverse, I mean, there have been a number of scientists like Paul Davies who have said there's no observable evidence that any of those universes exist, and there may never be. So what are we left with? We're left with a universe that seems to have had a beginning. This is the implication of Big Bang cosmology. So if the universe is not a brute reality, then what about God? I mean, when people say who created God, well, look, if the universe were truly a necessary reality or a real brute reality, we wouldn't ask for any further explanation. But the universe is not. It doesn't give any indication. It gives the indication that it is, in fact, contingent. But God would not be God if he needed a cause. And if you go back to an infinite regress, so who created the world? God did it. Who created God? God squared. Who created God squared? God cubed. Who created God cubed, etc. Well, even Aristotle, 2,500 years ago, said that's impossible because nothing would ever be explained. So I think the idea that God is a necessary being, that he is the first cause, he is uncaused, I think that this is not controversial in philosophical and theological circles today.
Well, it's interesting. I would wager to individuals such as yourself, the concept of, that which has a beginning must have a cause is, that's rote thought for you, right? For you and your peers, you just think like, oh, well, of course, right? Something I found very fascinating is how many YouTube atheists specifically that I've interacted with that don't seem to grasp the concept of that which has a beginning must have a cause. And that seems to either it's being willfully ignored or it's just not being comprehended as a significant difference of how this addresses the who designed God portion of what we're discussing right now. And that's kind of leads me to, and I'm sure you've dealt with this many occasions, the puddle argument and things, which I find to me, the puddle argument is almost an insult to your intellect. It's like, if you actually think that you don't have the capacity to be able to analyze these things and come to a conclusion one way or the other, then you're insulting your own intelligence. You're calling yourself stupid. And I found that's why every time I hear in my interactions, when I hear that argument put forth, I'm just like, so are you calling yourself dumb? Like, there's no scenario where I'm going to run around and be like, hey, I know I'm arguing adamantly for this, but I'm too stupid to comprehend what I'm arguing. Like, to me, that doesn't make any sense, but it's done with extreme amounts of pride and confidence by a lot of the more aggressive new atheists. Have you come across that at all?
Yeah, and one thing that I relate to that is when I look at the literature in philosophy, to the degree that I understand the science, because I don't have a background in science. I'm fortunate, however, to be able to talk with colleagues who have doctoral degrees in particular fields. But I sometimes think, and this is what I tried to do in the book, a lot of times the literature is kind of incomprehensible to a layperson. On the other hand, sometimes the literature in popular apologetics is so sloppy that they're trying to make it readable, but it becomes sloppy. I think what we need are really good books that have really good content, but they're reader friendly. They invite you to take that next step. And there, I think that, the lack of careful critical thinking, it's evident among our secular friends. It's also evident in our churches today, where people don't know, for example, the difference between a contingent reality or a necessary reality, or, as you said, that the Kalam cosmological argument is not arguing that everything needs a cause. It's arguing that anything with a beginning needs a cause. And that means a little logic, a little, rational study. I have to say, I'm shocked that our schools, our churches don't have courses in basic logic. I mean, I complimented you with the title of your program, Logical, Plausible, Probable. I mean, I think the idea of distinguishing between deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning is just a wealth. And when I go to my doctor and, he looks at my eyes and, I have a health problem, he's treating me, I'll ask him, how are you drawing, this diagnosis, and what kind of reasoning are you using here? I think logic is such a critical tool, and I'd like to see more people, both secular and religious people, pick it up. And I applaud your show. I like what you do.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. It really is one of the things you just said that really struck me was your point about a lot of the books either being so complicated or so sloppy that it's not achieving the desired outcome. And one of the reasons that I kind of got involved in what I'm doing now is I had a very similar moment of epiphany, I guess, when I was reading through a lot of these books on a variety of topics. But I realized, like, okay, in a lot of these instances, these high-level scholars and scientists, insert discipline, they're trying to dumb things down. Mm-hmm. And you have to focus. You have to have critical thinking skills. You have to be willing to go back and read again. You might want to use Google. If you don't understand a concept they're referring to, go read, get a quick understanding of XYZ concept, then go back and read it again because it's going to make more sense. Those kind of things. And we all know the average person doesn't have the patience.
Yeah.
And in many cases, they don't have the time to go and do that. And I think for a lot of the scholars, they think they've dumbed it down
Right.
and don't realize that they haven't gone far enough. I joke that it almost needs to be a translator for the translator, right? That bridge between the expert and the layperson that can kind of understand both sides of the equation. Yep. And I think that's something that's very lacking. And we could have a whole conversation about that. But something else I'd love to kind of dovetail all this into is, you mentioned this earlier. I think this is one of the current hot topics. I personally have watched I think 5 different debates in the last 2 months on this exact topic. And that is why doesn't the Bible condemn slavery? And you already alluded to this. It's the equivalent of antebellum Sal, chattel slavery, all these kind of things. What are your thoughts about this? And there's so many different angles to this concept. So number one, why did you decide to address this issue? And do you think that the concerns that are raised by the atheists and the agnostics, are they justified, unjustified, lack of knowledge, understanding? What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I appreciate it. And so now we're kind of transitioning to the question of whether the Bible's a good document. I mean, does it involve slavery? What is Christianity's relationship to slavery? So we're moving into those questions of our faith's goodness. Yeah, I would say a number of things. I think, first of all, that the Bible is a book that you have to take seriously. That is, you'll get a lot more out of the Bible if you do some basic understanding of where it came from, the genre of literature, how thinkers have interpreted, whether Hebrew thinkers in the Old Testament, Greek Christian in the New. I think when we look at the challenge of slavery in the Old Testament, you could use the word slavery, but you could also use the word bondservant. So this bondservant / slavery in the Old Testament that is practiced is fundamentally different than the slavery, prior to the Civil War. How so? Well, it is largely based in the Old Testament on economics. There were people that, we're talking about the ancient world. We're talking about people who sometimes didn't have the economic opportunities, so they would, in a sense, go to work for another individual. They would place themselves as workers. And this is a very different idea. It wasn't based upon race. It was not a servitude that would last forever. There were moral principles of the master did not have absolute say over the person's life. And I also think it also fails to recognize that it is true that the Bible never formally and explicitly condemns slavery. But I think it's very clear that the message of Scripture, that humans are made in the image of God, therefore have inherent dignity and moral worth, the idea that God, in the person of Christ, would come to redeem people, that people have value, that the abolition of slavery in the West, both in England and in America, were largely led by Christian individuals. And I think, too, that today we kind of, with our cancel culture, I sometimes think people think they're superior, but I wonder if you were to place us back in the South in the 1850s, or you put us back in, 1750, would we be like John Adams and come out and say, look, I think slavery is immoral, I wouldn't do it? Or would we be like Thomas Jefferson and say, well, I'm troubled by the idea, but, I have a plantation. I don't think slavery is a Christian problem. I don't think it is even a white person problem. Slavery is a human problem. Mm-hmm. And every single major culture in history had slaves. It was just as part of the economics of the age. Now, it is reprehensible It is a great evil. But I think that the people who embrace Scripture, both Jews and Christians, often led the way in arguing that these are people who are made in the image of God, and slavery is something that is not pleasing to the Lord and is immoral for our society.
Well, I think that point you're making is exemplified by the fact that I think it was Paul talks about that Christ is salvation is available for all men, free and slave,
Yeah.
and Jew and Gentile.
Yeah.
All are welcome by God, and Christ died for all. And to me, that foundational premise completely negates the argument.
The passage in Galatians is a revolutionary passage. No difference between Jew, Gentile, slave, free, male, female. All are one in Christ Jesus. I mean, Paul wrote that in the late 40s, in the first century, and we're still trying to work through the implications of that. But I completely agree, and I think there are many statements in the Old Testament that illustrate that that Yahweh, the Lord, unlike the Greek and Roman gods that are trying to seduce beautiful maidens, the God of Sinai is watching over widows and orphans and immigrants. I mean, Martin Luther King, a Baptist minister, was preoccupied with the minor prophets, that Yahweh cares about people who have no power, and so should we.
I agree. I agree completely. Now, instead of in our conversation us getting into the genocide conversation in question, I want the audience, hopefully you had your interest piqued in this great conversation we're having so far. So you need to go get the book and read all about the genocide. Did God commit genocide conversation? So you need to go and read the book, and or perhaps we'll have Kenneth back and we can discuss that one in much more detail. I think that topic is that's a hot one that honestly, I don't think we can go into enough detail tonight to do it real justice, and you go into great depth in the book. However, I would like to address, and this is a pretty commonly used talking point I hear all the time, and that is, how could Christianity possibly be true if, isn't Christendom hopelessly divided? There's hundreds, there's thousands, there's all these different denominations. If the Christian God is the quote unquote real one, why are all these people confused? And one of the things I hear on a regular basis is the interpretation problem. From a more formal perspective. Do I have that right? Or and do those claims have substance, in your opinion, that Christians need to actually address, not just kind of sweep under the rug?
I think you are exactly right. This is a critical question. It was one of the most important questions for me. I remember giving a lecture about, I made a case for the truth of God's existence and for the truth of Christianity. An atheist said to me later privately, he said, I actually thought some of your arguments were engaging, but which Christianity should I adopt? Look, they're all divided. And that stung, because I thought, he is making a criticism that has some merit. So what I do in the chapter is I say, look, first of all, I think that there is an enormous common ground. Now, there are certainly many liberal mainline churches that no longer believe in the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Atonement. They believe in, the brotherhood of man. There are people who have theologically have moved away from, they've apostatized from historic Christianity. But if you look at what I would call conservative Eastern Orthodoxy, conservative Catholicism, and conservative Protestantism, evangelicalism, there's an enormous common ground. And the common ground lies in doctrine, values, and worldview orientation. I mean, look at the Nicene Creed, for example. This is a creed that has been around for centuries. It's a creed that is affirmed in the eastern part of the world by the Eastern Orthodox. It's affirmed even by Coptic Orthodox. It's affirmed by Roman Catholics, and it's affirmed by most Protestants, and even some of the non-denominational evangelicals that are not creedal and liturgical in their worship. they often have some kind of statement that's similar to the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. Then I've even heard, interestingly enough, non-denominational churches, they sometimes sing a creed. I thought, wow, that's interesting. So if you look at the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, that's a pretty big slice of Christianity. It introduces us to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It has discussion about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It talks explicitly about the Holy Spirit. I think that there is a lot of common ground in doctrine. I mean, one person said, and I think it's correct, that evangelical Protestants, so these are doctrinally conservative Protestants, they probably could agree with 85% of what Roman Catholics believe. Well, Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholics are similar. We share values. We believe humans are made in the image of God. We believe in the dignity of people. We share the 10 Commandments. In terms of worldview orientation, we think of the worldview in stages. God created, he allowed humans to make choices, and there was the fall. Then came redemption in Christ, and what will come next is the consummation. So while it is true that we have, I think, a problem of denominationalism, and I'm even willing to critique my own branch of Christendom. I was at one time, I was baptized as a Catholic as a very small child. Late in my first years of college, I left the Catholic Church and became a Protestant. I think there is room for unity. I like to think of myself as a bridge builder. I like to think of myself as a peacekeeper. My natural instinct when I interact with Christians of other traditions or denominations is to say, what do we first hold in common? How significant is the common ground? Then let's move to the areas of difference. Now, having said that, I'm not saying there aren't real serious differences. I mean, the question of authority, the question of the relationship of church tradition to the authority of Scripture. In a Catholic context, the question of the Pope. Also, the issue of salvation. How does grace, faith, and work unpackage itself? What about Mary and the saints? So in my book, I list the common areas, then I discuss the areas of difference. So I would say, first of all, that historic Christianity is much more united, I think, than most people realize. But I also take steps and say, I think we should seek more unity. I think there are times when I go on Facebook and I see a Calvinist and an Arminian battling to the death, or I see a Catholic and a Protestant fighting the Reformation all over again. I will often tell them, maybe you ought to do that offline. I love what C.S. Lewis said. By the way, he's born in Belfast, Ireland. That's a place that's had some Catholic Protestant hostility.
Yes, they have.
The reason
that was still going on when I was growing. I grew up in England, actually. That was culminating with Sinn Féin and all that kind of stuff back in the '90s, late '90s when I was growing up. I'm very well aware of what you're talking about there. It's brutal.
Well, that book, Mere Christianity, which was the first Christian book I ever read. I mean, if you look at the preface, Lewis says that there is this mere Christianity. Lewis wanted the branches of Christendom to find real common ground. And of course, Lewis is always a storyteller. He says, think of the kingdom of God, think of Christendom as a large mansion. The different denominations are part of different rooms, but we meet in the hallways where we stand up together and we even debate one another. So I think what I would say to non-Christians is that a little reflection on church history and theology will illustrate that Christians are more united than most people realize. But I also have to admit this. I think sometimes Christians do things that get in the way of people giving careful consideration to the faith. And I think division is sometimes one of those areas. And I invite my Reformed friends. I mean, do we need all of these different Reformed churches where the differences are very minor? Couldn't we speak with one voice? How about the Lutherans all getting together? How about the non-denominationalists coming together and maybe being interdenominational? So I think there is division within Christendom, but it's not as serious as some people would suggest.
I would agree with you on that. I think what we've been discussing in this past couple of minutes, I think kind of, it's not entirely this next question, but it kind of transitions into it, has a little bit of relevance to it. And this kind of, two perspectives. And, what we hear all the time is, why isn't everyone, and you actually alluded to this earlier, why isn't everyone who calls themselves a Christian acting like Christ? Are they not really Christians? Are they just prodigal sons? Do they think they can do whatever they want because they're, saved? Could you kind of address this from, the Christian perspective, and then again I'll ask it again from the the atheist perspective, and I'll have a couple extra caveats. But if you kind of address that from the Christian perspective first, which you kind of were touching on, and then we'll get into the atheist side.
Yeah, I'm again reminded of Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who would say, well, if you want me to believe in your Redeemer, act a little more redeemed. Gandhi is said to have said, I like your Christ, I don't like your Christians. I think when it comes to hypocrisy, I write about two types of hypocrisy, and I write about them with the recognition that this is a very critical and important topic. Hypocrisy should never be excused. It should never be hidden. It should always be confronted, and if it's criminal, the people should be punished, and the victims should be helped. Right. Now, I do think there are two kinds of hypocrisy. One of them is what I would call a lower H hypocrisy, and that is original sin is a really big problem. Sin has deeply affected human beings. We sin in our thoughts, in our words, in our deeds, by what we do and what we fail to do. God has decided that though he saved us by the life, death, and resurrection of Christ on the cross, and we're saved by grace through faith, this process of salvation called sanctification, it's long, it's bumpy. I was telling Hugh Ross, my colleague and boss, I said, I think one of the most advances I've taken in sanctification is the recognition of the brokenness of my life, that I really am a fallen person and I need God's grace in my life. Well, all Christians make mistakes. All Christians sin. They struggle with anger or envy or gluttony or greed or lust or pride or sloth, the seven deadly sins, as the medieval theologians referred to it. But in that context, what is needed is repentance. I mean, every morning when I take a shower, I say, Lord, this hot water and soap is cleaning my body, but I need you to clean my soul. I need to be forgiven of the sins I struggle with. So I try to keep my connection with the Lord very close. Well, lowercase h is repentance. It may mean counseling. It may need more prayer, Bible study. But then let me move to capital H, hypocrisy. And that's when somebody's living a double life. When they are saying that they're committed to God, they're committed to Christ, but in reality, they have a whole other life. And with the capital H, that's much more serious. These people may be engaging in criminal behavior, and these people may not even be Christian. So, again,
quick interjection on that. I think something that oftentimes gets overlooked, and in many cases not even recognized, is from the less of the average atheist and more from the anti-theist perspective. It is known that there is a coordinated strategic effort to infiltrate seminaries and even gain positions in churches as leaders as an anti-theist, not becoming one, but being one prior to entering. And to me, when you really think about that from how horrific and how, just the level of hypocrisy that you're talking about is just, oh my goodness, how could Christianity possibly be true when you see X? And it's like, well, I'm not claiming this is across the board in every aspect, but we do know that there are people going in with the willful intent to leverage those positions of quote unquote leadership to negate the perception of Christianity itself. And I think that's something that doesn't get discussed, and it should be more in modern society.
And I think, to take your point head on, there are people who see themselves as enemies of Christianity. They think that religion is the worst. As Hitchens says, it poisons everything. It's one of the worst things in the world. Now, what I would say to my atheist friends is this: I would say, look, recognize that according to our worldview, according to the Bible, we are made in the image of God. We have rebelled against God. We are sinful individuals. We need forgiveness. We are broken. But now let me look at your worldview and look at your particular behavior. I try to live by the 10 Commandments. I try to love God and my neighbor as myself. I struggle with that. I don't usually go over to my neighbor and say, how you doing on your cholesterol? Have you tuned up the car lately? Are you saving enough money in your retirement? No, a lot of times I am a rather selfish individual. But let me then turn to my secular friends and say to them, how is your moral principles working out for you? And if you were to compare people who are religious and non-religious, I think it's fair to raise questions like the Inquisition, like the Crusades, the 30 Years' War, Salem witch trials. But could I then raise, my father was a combat soldier in World War II, and Stalin was responsible for the murder of tens of millions of people. Mao was a committed atheist. Communism, as part of its ideology, it officially adopted atheism. So was it wrong for those secular people? Were they being hypocritical? Richard Dawkins sometimes, I think, says silly things when he says, well, atheists do bad things, but they don't do bad things in the name of atheism. No, yes, they do. At least with Christianity, if a minister is found going out with a prostitute or embezzling millions of dollars, they should be held accountable. But you see, within Christianity, there are moral principles to judge those people. Mm-hmm. But in a world without God, where we're the product of blind, mechanistic, natural processes, are there objective moral principles to hold people accountable? So I accept that there are times my life, I would say to Friedrich Nietzsche, you're right. But you see, the problem of hypocrisy points to the solution, and the solution is we all need a savior. We are all broken people. We're all scarred by the life we live. That's why Jesus came into the world, to not for the Pharisees, but for the publicans, for the prostitutes, for those of us like you and me that struggle to live a moral life day to day.
Well, one of the things about that point you're making that I always find interesting from a personal perspective, and it's very relevant to me, is, when I was 18, I had won't go into long details, but encounter, shall we say, with some of those, the proverbial holier than thous, right? Even though I was already a Christian, and I was actually at a Christian university and had an encounter with a bunch of holier than thous. And that kind of catalyzed not a rejection of God's existence, but a willful decision to ignore God and to go and do it because, what? I will get my life right at some point. I know I'm right. I'm not going to be like these idiots, though. Like these hypocrites, the point you're making about the hypocrites, even as a believer, I rejected the hypocrisy. And I think that's something that kind of people don't think about until it's too late, almost, in terms of the impact it's having on people. Because when I think about my upbringing, my knowledge of theology, my family, all those kind of things, like I would be the last person you would think would be like, I know, I understand about all these things about scripture and theology and God and denominations. I have all this knowledge. I know it's true, and I'm out, for now. And I won't get there's a whole bunch of details of how I came back to the faith, but the irony for me is I never lost my faith, but I willfully rejected it. And when I think about what I did, I can only imagine how this must be applying to other people as well, on a very regular basis. And that the point you made about, hey, I'm a broken individual. I am flawed. I have my faults. And the entire reason that I need a savior is because I am imperfect. And I think, in my opinion, when we kind of look at things from that perspective, it puts the need for moral truth and the higher power, God, and all these things into an entirely different perspective, a different lens to view the world. And I think in modern society, we have this very myopic worldview that's been created by technology, and it's busy and all these things going on, and we're not actually contemplating things from a much bigger perspective. It's all talking points and buzzwords versus actual analysis. And it kind of leads me to one last question before we go into closing statements and then Q&A. So, audience, if you have questions for Ken, make sure you start tagging me. I got a couple of them already. Make sure you tag me and let me know what the questions are. We'll get into that here in just a moment. Don't forget, and again, when you ask questions, if you don't tag me, I probably will miss it because I'm having a conversation here. So make sure you tag me. Okay, so before we go into Q&A, and not to drop one of the biggest and most complicated questions on you at the very end, but as I'm sure for both Christians and atheists, this is a major topic. And I hope you can give people a glimpse of insight into this that will inspire them to go and read your book and then really contemplate this concept. So let's talk about what you covered at the end of your book, and that is, can Christianity make sense of longing and suffering? And specifically, it was a great discussion question you have at the end of the chapter. What is the basic Christian response to the problem of pain, suffering, and evil?
Yeah, and maybe the perennial question, maybe the perennial challenge that religious people, particularly theistic, maybe especially Christian people, face. How do we address this, both longing and suffering? And I see them together. On a personal level, when I was growing up, I was very restless. I was looking, I was searching. I thought to myself, I sense kind of an emptiness, a bit of a loneliness. And I thought to myself, maybe if I became a professional baseball player, and that was one of my early goals, that if I became a rich and famous baseball player and everybody knew my name, maybe that would satisfy me. Or maybe if I met the right young woman, maybe there would be this fulfilling relationship. Or, again, if everybody knew my name. And yet, the professional athletes I admired, their lives were not fulfilled by lots of money and success and fulfillment. And I began to recognize that this was not just a matter of being a little on the lonely side or being a bit on the introverted side. I was longing for deeper fulfillment in my life. I was looking for a philosophy that would give me kind of a rest and peace of soul. Again, one of my favorite Christian thinkers is Augustine. In his famous book, Confessions, he says to God, Lord, you've made us for yourself, and our hearts find no peace until we rest in you. And I can say that was my journey. It was the desire to find fulfillment. And it doesn't seem that pursuing fame, pursuing money, pursuing pleasure really does bring an abiding, satisfying fulfillment, what Aristotle might have called eudaimonia, this deep inner sense of satisfaction. Well, Jesus comes along and he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Now, I've read a lot about Krishna and Buddha and Confucius and Muhammad, and I can tell you none of those individuals ever said anything like what Jesus said. As a Christian, I have found a taste of that rest. I still long. I still have, I think, a leaky soul that desires to be in the presence of God. But let me then touch upon tying longing over to the question of suffering. I can tell you, to your secular listeners, when I drive by Children's Hospital of Orange County here in Southern California, I feel a little hurt inside. I know there are kids up there that are very young and they have cancer. And I think, Lord, what could your possible purpose be in letting these beautiful little kids die so early in life? And my father was a combat soldier in World War II. He saw a lot of action. He was a machine gunner in a rifle company. I remember my dad saying to me not long before he passed away, he said, son, do you think the Lord will hold me accountable for the men I killed in the war? And I said to my dad, I said, Dad, attached to your resume is going to be the words, "You helped stop the Holocaust." I said, Dad, you had to do it. You had to do it. So when we look at the world in which we live, I mean, just look at the 20th century, World War I, World War II, the Cold War. It seems to me that we live in a world where there's real evil. But if there's real evil in the world, then we live in a moral system, because something cannot be evil unless there is a standard of goodness by which it goes against it. So I might say to the non-Christian, I say, look, I agree. I don't always know why the Lord allows all of the evil and suffering that he does. But it may be possible in your secular world, you have an absence of goodness. How can you have evil without a standard of goodness? There are many theodicies that Christians have proposed through the centuries, and some of them are set forth in the Bible, the book of Job, etc. I would say that I think that God has an extraordinary way of allowing pain and suffering and evil, but bringing good out of it. I mean, Jesus's crucifixion, he comes into the world to save his own people. They reject him. They plan his crucifixion, but out of that incredible injustice comes salvation to all believe. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe in vacations and pleasure and having fun, but I've never learned anything profound. The times that I've learned a great deal are the times of suffering. Mm-hmm. The times that I have really grown in character have been when I said, wow, this is such a difficult problem. How am I understanding this? How am I to work through it? I like what Paul the Apostle says in the book of Romans, that God works all things together for good for those who love him, those who are called according to his purpose. I believe that God has allowed for people to have real personal responsibility, and we have shipwrecked that through sinful activity. But God is working in and through that. And I believe that there are oftentimes things you can only learn by going through suffering. One of my first teachers, Walter Martin, used to say, some people will not look up until they're flat on their back.
That is very true. I know that one well myself. And it's, the points you're making, there's so many different facets, in my opinion, to what you've just been outlining that I think get glossed over in just let's say the non-theist world. Mm-hmm. Of, if you operate from a materialistic worldview and everything by default becomes finite, and you now view your existence through a very narrow frame, and therefore everything in that frame becomes exponentially larger. And to me, when you apply the concept I just outlined there to the negatives, like, why is God allowing me X, Y, Z to happen? Well, if you're operating from an extraordinarily finite worldview, then whatever's happening is going to seem so incredibly unjust, so incredible. Just how could this possibly happen, right? What kind of a God would allow this to happen, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things I talk about is, I feel like a lot of times the atheists I'm interacting with are operating from that myopic worldview, and they're only being able to hyper-focus on one tile in a giant mosaic. When theists, from still a limited perspective, we can kind of step back and see a little bit of the bigger picture. But if you operate from the reality and the realization that God is seeing the entirety of that mosaic, suddenly a lot of these things that seem so unrealistic, so unreasonable, so unjust can take on an entirely different perspective. And I think in the context of, things with like kids, does it mean that what that child is going through at the time isn't horrible? Well, of course it is. Right. However, if you're operating from the perspective that child is now going to be in the presence of God and being able to have a stage of existence that is superior to the one that we're currently engaged in, it doesn't mean that from our current world or current perspective, it's not tragic, and it's not something that can potentially be a growth factor, as you were referring to. But from God's perspective, he
That's right.
recognizes that child is not being terminated. Like the existence of that kid is not ended. It's only just begun.
They're going to
And,
live in eternity. Yeah. Yeah.
and to me, just that concept, just that thought right there, it might not completely negate the points that are being made from the atheist worldview or even the agnostic worldview or perspective. But to me, it places an entirely different context on it, and kind of makes, in my opinion, at least for me, it kind of makes that whole, well, how could any God let this happen? If this God does, therefore I reject. To me, that doesn't really have much substance. Would you agree, disagree? I mean, what were your thoughts on what I just outlined there?
No, I do. I mean, I've studied the other world religions, and I think that's another challenge. How is Christianity true in light of all these other religions? But to relate to your point, I mean, in Christianity, God comes into the world. In fact, in the New Testament, in the New Testament, Paul says that Jesus became a slave. He became a bondservant. Jesus came into the world to save us, to lay down his life. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, I may think, look, boy, this poor couple, they have a child that has cancer through no fault of their own. But I think you're right on target. I mean, if you're a naturalist, if you're an atheist, if this world is all there is, then that comes from one perspective. But if there is another world, if there is an eternal world where people live in the presence of a loving and caring God, then that takes on a whole other kind of element. And, if you're going to raise the problem of evil, then you have to ask, well, where does the goodness come from? Because, there's no evil unless there's a standard of goodness. So I like the answers we have. Are they complete? Are they exhaustive? Do I never get discouraged? No. But I think the answers we have are reasonable. And I have to say, I think they're better than the other philosophies and worldviews I've studied.
Yeah, it really is interesting to me, the in my opinion, the lack of substance in a lot. I mean, okay, some of the other alternative theistic views, okay, they've got here and there, a lot of which it's similar. Ironically, a lot of the things I find like of substantive value from another theistic perspective. Like, it's like, well, that's basically the same argument. It's applying the same logic, if you will. But then when you're getting into the, kind of the nothings perspectives, to me, a lot of times it just doesn't make any sense. I'm like, how are you? I find those worldviews to be somewhat depressing, to be honest. That's just me. But okay, so I know you've been spending a lot of time, as I appreciate, and we've gone a variety of directions on this one. I really enjoyed our conversation. Hope we can have another one in the not too distant future. Do you have any before we get into some Q&A? It's pretty funny. I've actually been getting messages from folks saying, like, I kept asking for questions, and they're like, no, I agree. We do have a couple to get to. Do you have any closing thoughts for people on anything that we haven't covered that you think is of value and reason they should go and get your book?
Well, I mentioned abductive reasoning. One of the reasons I'm a Christian is I think Christianity does a good job of explaining the nature of reality. And we've talked a bit about human beings. We talked about hypocrisy. We've talked about evil in the world. I like what Blaise Pascal said. Pascal was a founding father of science. He was a physicist, mathematician, developed probability theory, died at 39 years old. I don't know how he accomplished so much, maybe because they didn't have television or YouTube in those days. But Pascal said that humans are an enigma of greatness and wretchedness. I think that's what Christianity says. It says we are made in the image of God. Therefore, you're going to see a human exceptionalism. Humans can do science, math, philosophy. But yet we're also what Pascal calls wretched. We're broken. We're fallen. I think Christianity does a good job of explaining humanity, I think better than other worldviews, better than other religions, and even better than atheistic naturalism and evolution. And so I like the idea that I think my faith explains the man in the mirror.
That's a very good. It's a very good point. Yeah. There's so many different directions and avenues of all of these concepts. To me, what I find so fascinating about these types of conversations that you and I are having, books like yours and so many others that attempt to go down these, to use the trite saying, the proverbial rabbit holes. To me, we just realize, for me anyway, I gain foundation to my worldview while simultaneously realizing that I know nothing, and that I actually have the whole concept of immortality for me anyway, takes an entirely different perspective of, it's not I will live forever, that's going to be boring. It's no, there's a potentially infinite amount of knowledge for me to gain, and I will have the capacity to understand it. Yeah. And in my opinion, that puts existence into a whole new vein. And I think very often we get so tied up with these much more esoteric and ethereal concepts that we kind of very often we forget about the real substantive components of both philosophy, religion, Christianity. I mean, all these different things that we're talking about, they're not just these, out there concepts. They actually have real substance to them, even though they're immaterial, but they're simultaneously material. And to me, that's something that kind of gets glossed over sometimes in these, in the back and forth, dialogues. People, we're all about winning. I want to have the objective. I want to conquer you, and all this. I mean, it's all the human response, right? Yep. It's something that I think it's difficult, especially in the era in which we live, where there is so much animosity and aggression. And I freely admit that I am guilty of the aggression, part of which I kind of view myself as a one of those guys on the front line, like, hey, yeah, I'm not going to be the most surgical. I might be more blunt. And then I expect the guy behind me to be more surgical, kind of thing. And that's I freely admit that. And, anyway, so guys, everybody's listening. Getting to Q&A. I got some good questions. Keep sending them in if you got anything more. Make sure you go to either reasons.org or to Amazon if you want to get the Kindle version. I got both links in the description. Make sure to check that out. And okay, thanks so much for joining us. And so without further ado, first question is coming from Pigs Can Fly. Says, LPP, can you ask Mr. Samples if he has compared Christianity to Zoroastrianism and Rastafarianism? I hear so much nonsense about the comparisons of these with Christianity.
Yeah, that's an interesting handle there, Pigs Can Fly. I'm really glad you asked that question. I think that Zoroastrianism, for example, when we think of the Middle Eastern monotheistic religions, we immediately think of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but we often fail to appreciate that there was a religion in Persia prior to the influence of Islam known as Zoroastrianism, and it was also Middle Eastern. Zoroaster lived to the degree that we can historically conclude he lived about the time as some of the Old Testament prophets. The religion is monotheistic in orientation. I think it is a fascinating religion. I've written a couple articles about Zoroastrianism, and I kind of compare them and contrast them with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I have a blog, Reflections by Ken, at wordpress.com. You can see some of those articles. I am familiar a little bit less with Rastafarianism, but I would say this. I think a major issue, just like tonight, we've talked a lot about secularism and science and those issues. I think there is another major objection that people have, and that is, how can you think Christianity could be true in light of all of these other religions? So in a couple of my other books, I try to do that. In fact, I have a book entitled God Among Sages, where I compare Jesus with Krishna, Buddha, Confucius, and Muhammad. And I do not disrespect those individuals. I think that there are many things we can learn. Remember, Christians believe that all people are made in the image of God, all people are the recipients of general revelation, and all of us benefit from common grace. So we're going to have things in common. And I believe non-Christians can teach Christians. Therefore, I think this question of how Christianity relates to the world's religions is very important. I think Zoroastrianism is a very interesting and intriguing religion. It's a very small religion, but there are Zoroastrians, and they have temples here, even in Southern California. So a couple of my articles might be helpful, and a book by a friend and colleague who is a real expert. Winfried Corrigan has a book, Neighboring Faiths. And I love Win, because when he writes about other religions, he writes empathetically, he writes fairly. He has no interest in diversionary tactics or straw man. So those are some sources that might be helpful to you.
Awesome. Okay, we got so linguistic. By the way, this question is from he's an atheist, but he's kind of in the more of the I don't know category. I've had interactions with him before. So linguistic, appreciate your question. If hypothetically there wasn't a God in the first place, how would you explain Christianity?
That's a thoughtful question. One of my chapters in the first part of the book is I ask the question, how do we explain the emergence of the church? Was the emergence and spread of Christianity, was it a purely natural explanation or supernatural explanation? So I then divide the chapter in half. The first part of the chapter, I argue that I don't think there is any reasonable conception of the origin of Christianity that doesn't involve the resurrection of Jesus. That the resurrection is really the reason why the church emerged into the world, why this message that began with the carpenter from Nazareth with 12 apostles, by the end of the century, it had become so popular that even Roman officials were talking about it. By the 4th century, it had conquered, in terms of evangelistically, it had conquered the Greco-Roman world. Today, there are 2.2 to 2.3 billion Christians. And I look at some of the natural explanations. I mean, Christianity did benefit from certain things. I mean, the Roman roads, the Greek language, it benefited from its ideas that human beings have dignity and value. I mean, the first 2 people groups to join Christianity, large people groups, were slaves and women. Because in the Roman Empire, I think Paul Copan says that in the Roman Empire, maybe 90% were slaves. I mean, women and slaves had really no rights in the Greco-Roman world. And when they encountered Jesus, it was like, wow, this individual does not look at the down and outers, the people with no power. He looks at them very differently. So now to get to your question, if I could, I can't conceive of how Christianity could have begun outside of the event of Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection. Now again, if you want other things, I mean, you could. I think some of the things that Buddhism teaches are very intriguing. I mean, the idea that life is suffering. I mean, I think the Buddha is very insightful in terms of his analysis of the human condition. I don't think his solutions carry a lot of water. I don't know if Krishna ever really existed. Confucius, I think, is very similar to some of the Old Testament prophets, and his desire to help China overcome, the warfare and things of that nature. But to be as candid as I can, I think there were natural factors that aided the development and spread of Christianity. But I can't see how Christianity would have got off the ground without some resurrection of Jesus. And in the book, I offer 20 evidences for the resurrection. So I'm going to encourage you maybe to take a look at that, or maybe you want to correspond with me on my blog page, if that would be helpful.
Interesting as you're If you're talking about the parallels, but then how they don't necessarily have the answer, and some of these different components. But then specifically, your point on the crucifixion and resurrection. Yeah, what it ultimately, in my opinion, what it ultimately boils down to is either the supernatural does exist and Christ was raised from the dead, or Christianity is the greatest hoax of all time. Like, there is no other. Obviously, there's nuances in both sides of those positions, but ultimately, in my opinion, it kind of breaks down to that point. Like, it's either one or the other. And I know I'm not the first person to raise that argument. I know it's a foundational argument in for a lot of atheists, but that to me, it's like, that's where we're at, folks. Like, it's either one or the other.
A quotation from Jaroslav Pelikan. Jaroslav Pelikan was a historian of Christianity at Yale University. He had this rather enigmatic statement. He said, if Christ is risen, nothing else matters. And if Christ is not, nothing else matters. I think your point is a very powerful one. If Christianity is a fake, I think the apostles knew it. And that creates this consternation inside me. Why would they die for a lie? I guess you could go back to Judaism, or you could go back to, earlier ideas, but I can't conceive of Christianity apart from the resurrection historically.
Yeah, to me, when you really contemplate having a brain freeze on it, but there was an interesting debate I watched a couple weeks ago. It's from like 10 years ago. I forget, man, I'm drawing a blank on the names, but it was the Jesus hoax was the argument being made by one side, and the other most kind of on the defense. And it was very interesting listening to it. And a lot of those points you were just making, and then the counters, and it's just like, we're at a dichotomy. It's a stark one. And that quote you made fits it perfectly. All right, now before we get to CJ's question, which I think will take a little more time to answer, Slam RN, she's a fan of yours, and she asked me twice. So is Christianity Cross-Examined? Is it rational, relevant, and good? Is it only available on Kindle, or is there a paper version because she loves tomes? Yes is the answer to that one. The hardcover, the paper version is available on reasons.org. It's currently the featured product. And Slammer, and I've got the link to that in the description if you want to go over there, or if you want the Kindle version, I've also got the link in the description to go over to Amazon on that one. Okay, so now let's see. All right, the Synagogue says, Mr. Samples, how far does your ecumenism, can't pronounce this word. Ecumenism. There we go. Do you draw the line at Catholics, Mormons, Muslims, Jews, in light of interfaith prayers held at this question is very pressing.
Yeah, I really thank you for that question, because it's something I'm really interested in. I like to think of myself as a very ecumenical person. I like watching debates, and I've participated in a good number of them myself, but I think I prefer dialogue more. And you've asked a very good question, and it's one I think about a lot, because my parents grew up evangelical Protestants. And I think after the Second World War, my dad was in Rome when Rome was liberated, and he walked into the Vatican. And I think it left an impression on the mind of a young man coming from rural West Virginia. He thought, wow, I've never seen a church like this. So my parents in the early 60s converted to Catholicism, and I was baptized as a 4-year-old. But as a college student, I became an evangelical. And I've always had a deep connection. In fact, I think St. Augustine is my favorite thinker, because he really bridges the gap between Catholics and Protestants. Now, how do I lay this out? Well, I think if you can affirm the Nicene Creed, if you can affirm the Apostles' Creed, I think you're affirming a very large slice of historic Christianity. Conservative Catholics, conservative Protestants, conservative Orthodox affirm those historic creeds. Now, there are still differences about the Pope's relationship to the patriarchs in the Eastern Church, relating to the authority of Scripture. Luther and Calvin raised the question of sola scriptura. And then, of course, questions about grace, faith, and works. I tend to see Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants as all part of Christendom. I would place Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses outside of the camp. Why? Because they cannot affirm historic Christianity. They deny the Trinity, the Incarnation. They deny salvation by grace. And again, and yet I affirm, for example, Seventh-day Adventists are genuinely Christian. So I want to be as ecumenical and as inclusive as I can, but I have to contend for truth and then promote unity and hopefully do it all in the spirit of charity. And so, I like Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox to dialogue. And when I talk to Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons who knock at my door, I raise these kinds of questions. So, no, I think that Hindus and Buddhists and Zoroastrians and Confucianists are outside of the Christian camp. And I think that historic Christianity would include Christendom. Now, again, I don't get to make all of these decisions, but I would encourage you to take a look at the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. And if you are a Christian, ask yourself, how much of Christianity is reflected there? I think a lot. And yet there are also, at times, I think, wow, there are some serious differences between Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox. And I try to get into that in my chapter. And by the way, that's my favorite chapter. That's the chapter that I have the biggest investment in.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about that, the short version of my thoughts on this topic. I think there's, obviously, as you were pointing out, there's the nuances, there's the similarities, there's the crossovers, there's the dichotomy, there's the differences, all those kind of things. When it comes down to the individual, I think is where the rubber meets the road. I'm a Catholic. Oh, I'm a Christian. There's all these different things that people say, all sorts of things. What they actually, that individual believes and what their decisions are, I think are what and obviously God only knows that answer. And the reason I bring this up is it really struck me. So a gentleman used to work for me. He actually died in my house. He had cancer. This is last year. He had cancer that metastasized. He and his wife became homeless, and I had actually let them stay with me all the way up to the end. And he was a very staunch Catholic. And he and I had many conversations about different things. And it ultimately boiled down to, over the course of our conversations, even though he ultimately, less, 3 days before, he had his last rites come. He had the priest come and talk because he knew he was getting close. But in our conversations, talking about, I asked him directly, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? Yes, I do. All these different, now he had some different things, about Mary and some of these different stuff, but ultimately it boiled down to, yes, he believed that Jesus Christ died on the cross for him. Yes, he believed that he was the way, the truth, and the life, and that he must believe, and he must confess with his mouth that God raised him from the dead, and he shall be saved. And to me, as I spent time with a man who was facing death and knew his time was near and was searching for the salvation, right, in terms of knowing, I think very often we, from the purely philosophical and theological perspective, I think we kind of get so sometimes, and I'm not saying we should dismiss all of the arguments about like what is and what is not. I'm not saying that at all. But in the context of the individual, I think sometimes we need to be a little bit more open-minded of, we don't know what God puts in front of them in those moments of truth that impact what that person believes, not what the overall doctrine is, but what their realization is in those moments of truth. And anyway, I don't want to go a long-winded diatribe about that, but that's something I think is significant. That
I think
especially until we face those moments of facing our own mortality, it's hard for us to really grasp what God can put in front of you.
I think 2 quick points, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. When I'm speaking to it, of course, I'm speaking to it in the context of denominations, theological traditions, etc. But you've brought us back now to the very personal side. I mean, Christianity is a historic movement that has influenced the world over a 2,000-year period. But Christianity is also a personal relationship that a person has with the triune God, with Jesus, the Savior. And, they may have many church connections, but ultimately, what is our relationship to God? Another point that kind of sparked in my mind, and that is about suffering. When I've gone through very difficult things, I think the Lord allowed it because it then gave me empathy about other people. I've had struggles in my life, and it's opened me to the fact that when I meet people, they have difficulties. I think it was Rousseau who said most men live lives of quiet desperation. There's a lot percolating in the heart and the mind of individual, and at the end, it does come down to what you said. What do I believe about God, and how am I made right with God? And that's very personal.
Yeah, it's very, very true. And I think, we come to a close. I think it's very important. That's why one of the reasons after, as I poured through your book, I really, I'd already agreed to have you on, but I was excited to have you come on and let's have this conversation, because I think a lot of times these concepts, as you talked about, aren't addressed from the more, hey, let's get down to the brass tacks of these things. Let's actually look at them from a understandable perspective, from a realistic one. Yes, let's apply the intellectual concepts. Yes, let's apply philosophy and theology and all these principles to it. But let's also put this into real world application, and not just run around in circles forever. Nobody actually has the capacity to reach a real conclusion because we get so tied up in the minutia. And like I said, the point you made about coming down to the personal moment, and you talk about your father in World War II. Both of my grandfathers were World War II, and I remember standing back when I lived in England. My grandfather on my mom's side came over and visited us one time, and we went over to Normandy. And he had been a soldier at Normandy. And I remember, I think I was 11 years old maybe, and I remember standing on the outcropping looking over the English Channel, and I looked up at my grandfather, and you could see it in his eyes that he was remembering all the things that had happened on that day, which I can only imagine what unless you experience it, there's no way you could possibly imagine, even consider it.
Yeah.
And I remember looking up at him and I said, "Hey, Grandpa, so what was it like? Like, what happened?" And he paused for a moment. He kind of looked down at me. He was in his late 60s at that time, and so he had the real grandfatherly air.
Yeah.
And he said, he looked at me and he said, "Well, I was on a boat, then I got on a smaller boat, then I was on the beach, and then we were at war." And that's all he said. And he was kind of not brushing it off, but kind of making a little toning it down a little bit. But to me, having looked in his eyes, I knew that there was way more to that.
Yeah.
And I use that as an example of, these moments of experience in life that until you have gone through those hard times, it's very difficult to have the empathy with somebody, to truly appreciate what they're going through and to try and reach out to them and help them. And to me, when you think about all of that in the context of God wanted to be able to have empathy.
Yeah.
And that was not the only, but one of the primary purposes for our Savior, was to be able to be as one of us and to understand. And I think that's something that we oftentimes forget. And
great point. Great. I mean, I've gone through suffering. I can empathize. And now I know God knows what it's like to suffer because Jesus, the Son of God, suffered. You got a great show talking about ideas. I mean, this is how I'd like to spend a Thursday night. I mean, I wish other people who are not Christian would appreciate that many Christians really love the life of the mind. They love the world of ideas. And you obviously do, and you got a great show. And you are very generous giving me the kind of time you have.
Oh, of course. Well, Kenneth, I really appreciate your time. Everybody, make sure you go check out the links in the description. Go get Kenneth's new book. It's fantastic, and I strongly recommend it. And thank you so much for your time, and I hope I have you on again soon.
Thank you, sir.
All right, everybody, as we wrap up, make sure, as I always like to say at the end of these things, as you contemplate the different facets of your existence, the evidence, the reasons, and all of the other components as to, what are the underlying necessities for your existence, Make sure that the conclusions you reach are logical, plausible, and ultimately probable. Have a good night, everybody.